Let's turn now to our CBS News political director, Steve Chigueras, who is in our Washington bureau watching these developments unfold. Steve, we've been talking about all evening long the evolution of the Trump administration's position on Syria. How stark a contrast is this from just where the administration was and the signals that it was sending out a week ago about what it intended to do about Bashar al-Assad?
Yeah, I mean, a week ago, you had Secretary of State Tillerson basically saying Assad is up to the people of Syria and how they're going to handle that. And that was 1 week ago. And then you just look back, in 2013 when the debate was going on about whether the United States should launch military strikes against Syria at that time. Trump was extremely vocal against launching military strikes on Twitter. As we all know, that's his preferred mode of communication. He was very aggressive toward President Obama at the time and said, don't do it. Repeatedly said that. And so it's a complete 180 from where President Trump was back then and even really during the campaign and where his own Secretary of State was last week. So total shift. But as we heard the president say yesterday, he saw those pictures after the chemical attack in Syria and said that it changed his mind. And so he was affected by what he saw on television.
We were supposed to be talking about President Xi, the Chinese president's trip to the United States, to Mar-a-Lago. That was expected to be the big focus. But instead, we are talking about this strike in Syria. Steve, I want to ask you about how important respect is. One analyst I had earlier today talking about China was saying that it's important that the Chinese realize that whether they have respect for this president and that they can trust him. When you're talking about the folks on Congress and Capitol Hill, we're seeing both Democrats and Republicans who were so divided on issues like Gorsuch, on health care. Many of them releasing statements today commending the president, talking about how he's gone forward with the strike against Assad. Do you expect there to be more bipartisanship considering the strike has just taken place?
Yeah, I think in the immediate aftermath, yes, that's the case. I mean, you're seeing liberals on the Hill basically saying that he shouldn't have done this, but most, including Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, are saying this was the right move, at least initially. But moving forward, please let Congress know what your plans are and involve Congress in your decision making. That's what you're hearing from a lot of Democrats who are supportive of this initial move. And that's, I think what that signals is that this is going to be a big debate on Capitol Hill moving forward. Add that to the pile of things that Congress is going to be dealing with this administration. Now add the authorization of the use of military force. The ranking member, the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, said he's going to introduce a bill to do just that, which is the debate that was going on back in 2003 and 2013 and 2015 when there was a discussion of military action in Syria. And so that debate's going to come back to the forefront. It was a bitter debate in 2013. It'll be interesting to see how that shapes up. You mentioned the partisanship in this town. I call it hyper-partisanship, and it's even more partisan than it was just 4 years ago. And so in light of what happened with Gorsuch and everything else that's going on Capitol Hill, it's going to be very interesting to watch to see how this debate plays out moving forward. But as you did mention, initially, Democrats and Republicans generally are supporting the initial action from President Trump.
Well, Steve, as we've been talking to you, we should tell our viewers what's been happening at Mar-a-Lago, the President's Club in Florida, where the president spoke just a short time ago about this strike. Since then, we know our Margaret Brennan is among those reporters who is there attending an off-camera but on-the-record briefing with Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, as well as the President's National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster. And as part of that briefing, we're hearing from our Margaret Brennan that despite repeated questions, neither Secretary Tillerson nor H.R. McMaster would say whether China's Xi Jinping, the president of China, was informed of the Syria strike. So an interesting dynamic as you imagine that unfolding there. The president, as you've been talking about, really wanting to focus attention on China, but of course world events, as they often do, changing the agenda here for the president. The reporting from Margaret about this briefing, Secretary Tillerson was asked about this reaction and the decision by the president to go ahead and authorize this strike. Secretary Tillerson telling reporters this was not an emotional reaction at all on this decision to not turn a blind eye on chemical weapons. I wonder, Steve, if you could talk a little bit about all of this happening against the backdrop of reporting that we had been talking about regarding the President's National Security Council and the moving of Steve Bannon off that principals committee, where it had been a controversial decision from the start. The president had decided to install Steve Bannon in a place that many U.S. officials had said was not a place for someone with political leanings to be. And in fact, what we saw just this week was, as some have suggested, perhaps the rising influence of H.R. McMaster. And I'm wondering, Steve, what is it that you can tell us about some of this shuffling? Because we heard from the White House an attempt to frame this as Steve Bannon no longer needing to be in that position because Michael Flynn, the former National Security Advisor, had stepped down, and therefore he was no longer needed there to serve as a check on Michael Flynn. But this was, in fact, a demotion. This is, in fact, a reshuffling of the National Security Council.
Yeah, I mean, you can call it a demotion. It was telegraphed when McMaster was named National Security Advisor that he was going to have a say on these types of decisions. And so clearly what the decision he made was, let's go back to a more traditional principals committee, which is really almost the same setup as what President Obama had when he set up his principals committee in 2009. It looks very similar to that, the kinds of people that are on there. When Mike Flynn and President Trump came in and they set up the Principals Committee in January, it was a complete departure from what President Obama had. So this goes back to a more traditional sense. I mean, there's no question there's a lot of palace intrigue going on at the White House right now. Our reporting shows that there is a growing influence of the people who are close to Donald Trump. And it's interesting because, we look throughout Donald Trump's career and his life outside of the White House, and even during the campaign, and his closest friends and advisors are all family members. And what we're seeing a little bit more of is the Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump wing of the White House getting a little bit more influence now than the outsiders. And I think we're seeing a little bit of shuffling. We saw Reince Priebus's deputy chief of staff be dismissed last week. We're now seeing Bannon being moved out of the National Security Council. But you're not really seeing much effect on Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump. In fact, Jared Kushner, you can argue, is involved in almost everything that's been going on these days. And so, again, this is, you got to wonder what's going on in the president's mind, but what it seems like is happening is that, again, he's leaning heavily on the people closest to him, his family, and those are the people it seems that he trusts the most. And I think we're seeing a bit of that going on at the White House at this point.
We're receiving word, Steve, that the White House notified 24 members of Congress. They were briefed either by the White House or cabinet officials of the airstrike tonight. Do you think that these members of Congress, bipartisan folks, will commend the president for actually having the administration reach out and give them some sort of heads up on this airstrike?
Yeah, you've seen that in a few of the statements. They're appreciative of the fact that there was outreach there. And again, I think this is going to be, they're setting up the debate moving forward, which is, okay, fine, that's nice that you called us and thank you for doing that. We appreciate what you've done in terms of this initial reaction, but make sure that you give us a plan moving forward. This is a big issue. It's not going to end after tonight's airstrike and missile strike. And you need to let us know what your strategy is moving forward and then work with us moving forward before you make these decisions again. At least that's what some of these Democrats are saying. And in fact, Bob Corker, a Republican senator from Tennessee, said something similar in his statement as well. So I think there's going to be a bit of that you're going to hear a bit of that over the coming weeks. Keep in mind, too, Congress is leaving for the Easter break for the next couple of weeks. So while we may hear a little bit about it, this debate on the Hill is not really going to ramp up again probably until the end of the month. It's going to be really statements and whoever shows up on the Sunday shows or on cable news or CBSN in the next couple of weeks. This debate is not going to happen until later in the month. And keep in mind, too, Congress has to deal with a budget issue. They have to deal with a short-term budget issue before the end of the month. So there's a lot on their plate, but there's no question I think Syria is going to be now brought to the forefront, and whether Congress is involved in in authorizing every use of military force moving forward.
All right, Steve Chigueras in Washington for us. Thanks very much.
Thanks.